If this is what democracy looks like to these people, lights off on any signs of dissent while celebrating the voteless anointing of their chosen insiders, if that's what democracy looks like, we are in a world of trouble. And no matter how many amazing singers or sports coaches or sports stars or Oprahs appeared on the stage, I could not shake this moment. I will never shake that moment. And as soon as the literal sign of disunity was purged from the arena, the lights were turned back on and the fake unity show continued.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 299th episode of this listener-supported podcast called Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And in today's episode, I'm going to tell you today about the Democratic National Convention, which is the convention that was held to formally nominate the Democratic Party's nominee for president. And I'm going to talk about it today because I was there. I was on the ground in the arena, at least most of the time. And today I'm going to tell you the story of the convention that you probably didn't see on television. Because from what I've seen of the coverage, the American people who bothered to watch seem to have been led to believe that the Democratic Party is in total unity right now. We all love Kamala. There's so much joy. But on the ground, in events that were literally hidden from public view as much as possible by the Democratic Party, well, it seemed very clear to me that the way that the Democratic Party is choosing to deal with disagreements within its ranks is to pretend that those disagreements simply don't exist. And so today, I'm going to share with you what I witnessed at the DNC, because the Democratic Party is not experiencing the kumbaya vibes that the television coverage may have led you to believe. But before I get into what actually happened at the Democratic National Convention, let's just get a few things straight about why this event was being held in the first place. Because in a lot of ways, the Democrats' convention was kind of fake. So first of all, this was the third presidential candidate nominating convention that I've attended this year, which proves that in the United States of America, we do not have a two-party system. In reality, we have a no-party system. The United States Constitution does not mention political parties at all. And therefore, because the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and the Libertarian Party and the Green Party and every other party that exists is not a part of our actual electoral system, that means that each party is in fact its own private club, and they make their own rules for how they choose their nominees. Right now, for all of their many, many flaws, the Republican Party is operating in a pretty democratic way according to their rules, proven by the fact that Donald Trump is the nominee again, despite the party elders absolutely despising the guy. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Sarah Palin, Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, Mike Pence. All of the living presidential and vice presidential candidates from the Republican Party since the turn of the century were no-shows at the RNC this year. That party has been fully surrendered to the MAGA people, and the Republican convention, it really was a weird Trump-themed carnival. Now, in comparison, the Democratic National Convention felt more serious, as in the discussions were about policy, and the attendees were more diverse in every way. There were a lot more young people, and there was more representation of every race. It felt like a gathering of people from the entire United States, as opposed to a gathering of Trump lovers. And so the DNC was certainly less cartoonish, with a noticeable lack of people literally wearing costumes of the candidate and a lack of ball gowns with Trump's name and or face on them. The level of weird was turned way down at the DNC compared to the RNC. But so was the democracy. Because unlike the Republicans, the Democrats had a nominee who was not chosen by their voters. And this was a reality that went completely unacknowledged inside of that arena. But the reality is that because the Democratic Party, as a private club, makes its own rules, it used its rules to simply switch the candidate from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris with no voters required. Because technically, the Democratic Party did have a primary, during which voters made their choice via voting or through caucuses. Now, when this happens, the voters are actually giving instructions to delegates, who are human beings, who are then supposed to go to the convention and cast their votes for the nominee on behalf of the voters or the caucus attendees. And delegates are supposed to vote according to the vote or caucus results in the first round of voting at the convention, although they're not required to. Basically, our votes in the Democratic Party primary or caucus system are merely suggestions for the delegates. But on top of that reality, the Democratic Party has also built in backstops to make sure that democracy, the will of the voters, doesn't nominate someone that the party leaders don't approve of, which is a lesson that Bernie Sanders, the independent senator from Vermont, learned the hard way. Twice. Because the Democratic Party has superdelegates, who are party leaders and elected officials who get to vote as they choose. And superdelegates played a key role in stopping Bernie Sanders from getting the nomination back in 2016. Now, since then, the Democratic Party has changed their rules to limit the power of superdelegates. But the point is that the party changes the rules as it sees fit. Because again, the parties are not an official part of our electoral system. They are private clubs. And this year, the Democratic private club didn't need superdelegates or any other tricks to nominate the person that the leaders wanted. This year, after hosting a primary that featured only Joe Biden and a few other people, including Marianne Williamson and a congressman named Dean Phillips, who were then blackballed by the corporate media and who were never permitted to debate Joe Biden. Well, after Joe Biden won the primary that the party had designed for him to win, it became clear that, whoopsie, Joe Biden was suffering with some kind of maybe dementia or something. I'm no doctor. But we all saw the debate during which Joe Biden wasn't able to form full sentences, and so the party decided to pull a candidate switcheroo. And after Joe Biden was pressured by party leaders to stop running for re-election, all 50 Democratic Party state chairs, party leaders, and Democratic governors from all over the country publicly endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris as their pick for the nomination. And then the Rules Committee for the party gathered to determine the new rules that they would use to make Kamala the nominee. Because again, they make their own rules. And out of that meeting of the Rules Committee came rules that allowed the party to officially nominate Kamala Harris as the nominee before the convention even took place. Now, the excuse that they used for this is that they said that some states had early August deadlines for the nominees in order for those nominees to make it onto the ballots. But a fact check by Reuters proved that to be untrue. Regardless, using that excuse, the Democratic Party had the delegates vote virtually on August 1st. Making Kamala Harris the nominee 18 days before the convention even began. Which means that the main purpose of the DNC this year became basically the moment that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz accepted their nominations, something that they too could have easily just done over Zoom. The delegates, after that virtual roll call, really had no reason to be there other than to party. And according to the manager at the hotel where I stayed, which is in the center of McCormick Place where half the DNC events were held, well, according to the hotel manager, their occupancy rate for convention week dropped by 40% after the virtual roll call, which tells me that a lot of delegates just decided to say fuck it since their presence was no longer required. And in fact, I was staying at that hotel because the prices also dropped by half after the virtual roll call. And so I switched from my original plan, which was to stay 5 miles away, and I decided to switch hotels and make my life a whole lot easier. Or at least I thought I was making it easier. But the point is that the whole event was essentially a pep rally. A pep rally for a person that was nominated by party leaders with no voting by us required. And this was not acknowledged in any way at the convention on the stage. Although I do have to say it was noted plenty via snide comments from journalists who snickered under our breath during speeches about the Democrats being the party of democracy. And that was a theme with the Democrats at their convention. Whenever a reality didn't match the image that they were trying so desperately to project, they hid that reality, either by not talking about it or allowing others to talk about it, or literally turning the lights off so that no one could see. Because the image they tried to project, It would have been so cool had I been able to lean in and believe it. Because the word of the event was joy. And you could tell that the party faithful, the delegates who do the work of getting out the votes and taking the marching orders from the leaders, they were feeling the joy. Probably because they were all liquored up, as I've never seen so many open bars in my life. But, unlike the RNC, the messages at the DNC were largely positive. There was a joyous vibe. And the musical guests were genuinely exciting. Little John came out, Pink, although there was no Beyoncé. We were all fully expecting Beyoncé to open for Kamala on night 4. That rumor had legs. But the point I'm trying to make is that this convention was fun. And there wasn't a single speech so toxic that I felt the need to walk out, which happened constantly at the RNC as the speakers bashed all Democrats and bashed immigrants and trans kids. The RNC, I've got to tell you, up on that stage, toxic, toxic, toxic. But there was really only one target of negative vibes on the stage at the DNC, and that target was Donald Trump himself. And I'm not going to walk out on any speech for trashing him. He deserved almost every word of it, although I do have to say that there were quite a few unnecessary lies about Trump. The guy is bad enough, from not paying people who have worked for him to fucking porn stars while his wife is pregnant to faking 7 election certifications and trying to stay president. There's plenty of deserved trash to talk about Trump without lying about him. But, for example, the DNC speakers kept trying to blame Donald Trump for the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Now, that document is cuckoo bananas, and I hate so many of the ideas that are in it, but it wasn't written by the Trump campaign. It was written by dorks at the Heritage Foundation in the hopes that Trump would adopt it if president. But the Trump campaign had nothing to do with writing Project 2025. In fact, they have disavowed it many times. But you wouldn't know that for how often it was brought up at the DNC, as if it was written by Trump himself. But overall, especially Tuesday night when the Obamas were speaking, Michelle Obama lit that place on fire. Her speech was so good. And there were times when I wished that I could just turn my brain off and forget how Kamala became the nominee. And forget that I was surrounded by people accepting gobs of corporate money while talking about corporate greed. And forget that this place was crawling with lobbyists, like the nice man I sat with for 30 minutes whose job it is to lobby for regime change in Iran. A man that Senator Gary Peters went out of his way to run over and say hello to, while treating me like a piece of wallpaper. I wanted to forget all of these things. I wanted to feel the hope and the joy and the excitement for the possibility of the first woman president, which is one thing that I can feel genuinely excited about in this election. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't lean in. Because despite all of their attempts to hide them, and maybe because of all the DNC's attempts to hide them, I could feel Palestinians everywhere. And that's the story I want to tell you today. So before the DNC even began, the buzz was all about the protests, or even riots, that people were expecting to deal with in the area around the bubbles. And the bubbles are how I describe the security perimeters. Plural, bubbles, because at this convention, there were 2. And so the bubble you saw on TV was the United Center bubble. This was the area that is usually home to the Chicago Bulls basketball team and some hockey team, and forgive me for forgetting the name, but I don't care about hockey. But the security perimeter around the United Center was huge, and for some reason, the DNC decided to only have 2 entrances into the United Center bubble, and both of them were in hard-to-find locations. And I have no proof of this, but I suspect that they wanted to make it hard for protesters to find the entrances, and mission accomplished, but they also made it hard for attendees as well. Because like I said, there were 2 bubbles at the DNC, and the other one was at McCormick Place, which was approximately 5 miles away from the United Center, very close to the Great Lake. But the other location is where the caucus meetings and the vendor expo were located, and that area also had a lot of hotels that were full of delegates. And because there were 2 bubbles miles away from each other, one of the few things that we were told before the convention was that there would be shuttles to take us safely between the 2 locations. And please allow me to bitch for a second about the shuttle logistics, because the DNC, logistically, in so many ways, was a f***ing mess. Because the shuttles didn't even start running until 3:30 p.m. every day, even though journalists and volunteers and members of Congress, a lot of people, had to be at the United Center earlier in the day, which meant that we had to find our own way. I took the subway, but a lot of other people were taking Ubers because they had corporate cards. But I digress. But on day one, I did take the shuttle, and oh boy, was that a mistake. Because like I said before, the geniuses at the DNC only arranged for 2 entrances to the United Center bubble. And when you have everyone show up at the same time, those entrances get crushed. And so first, the buses, which were arriving from all over the city at the same time, had to wait in line to drop us off at a single drop-off point. Some people told me they had to wait for 2 hours just to get off the bus, although I had demanded, along with about 10 other people on my bus, to let us off the bus so that we could walk. But even though I had cut in front of the mile-long bus line by walking in, the security line still took me about an hour to get through. Because even though they had 8 metal detectors at that entrance, every single person had to check in at a single desk to show our credentials. And so those metal detectors, most of the time, were empty. And this obvious choke point wasn't fixed at any point in the following 3 days. But I believe, again with no proof, but I believe that one of the reasons that they only had 2 entrances very far away from one another and not easy to find from the subway or from anywhere else, I think they did this to deter protesters from gathering around the entrances. Because we do know that the protesters had permits, and their permits were valid for nowhere near the convention. They deliberately kept the protesters out of sight, and had I not been taking the subway as often as I did, because the shuttles were such a shit show, I easily could have gone the entire week without seeing a single protester, even though I know they were there. The DNC wanted those protesters out of sight and out of mind, but it didn't turn out that way. Because if security was concerned, as we know they were, about protests and riots, it seemed like a security concern to have buses full of delegates and other people sitting still for 2 hours on neighborhood streets. We felt vulnerable on those buses. And it also felt like a security concern to then force every attendee, delegates, journalists, congressmen, senators, governors, everyone, waiting outside of the perimeter to get through security for an hour or more as well. The DNC got lucky that the protesters didn't show up at the security entrance locations, and they got lucky that the protesters didn't show up in full force by the thousands until Thursday, and that the protesters were entirely peaceful. But waiting on those buses and in the security lines, surrounded by dudes with guns and barriers and fences, the protesters didn't even have to be there to have their presence felt. They were on everyone's mind and were a topic of conversation before the conference even started. And every day after. But the DNC, they tried their hardest to shut that conversation down. One of the DNC 2024 moments that will stay in my memory forever, and which you probably don't know about if you were watching on TV, happened on day 1 when President Biden spoke to the convention. Early in President Biden's speech from one of the suites right across the arena from where I was sitting in the C-SPAN suite, just a few minutes after President Biden started talking, 3 delegates unrolled a huge banner that said, in the colors of the Palestinian flag, quote, "Stop arming Israel," unquote. Now, from President Joe Biden's perspective, from on that stage, the banner was on his right, and rewatching the footage, he saw it. And he kept right on talking while glaring with his squinty, angry face at that section in the back of the arena. But as soon as the Florida delegates who were sitting in front of the banner saw it, they raised their "We Love Joe" signs to block the banner from the cameras. And they started this "We Love Joe" chant, which you can hear was started way in the back and in the middle of Joe's sentence to drown out the commotion being caused by the delegates who were literally hitting the people holding the banner.
Clear and present threats to our very democracy. Thank you.
And you didn't see any of this on TV because the camera was focused on Nancy Pelosi chanting, "We love Joe." But I'm not really mad at the cameramen for this because the DNC had quickly arranged for the lights to be shut off in the entire section where the banner was being shown. And they did that so that the banner could be removed along with the delegates involved with displaying it. And one of the 3 delegates was interviewed by Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! As he was being escorted out of the arena by security.
My name's Leano Sharon. I'm a DNC delegate from Michigan.
And what did you do today?
Today we held up a sign protesting the murder of children in Gaza and the continuing genocide.
Watch your step, watch your step. What did the sign say?
It said, stop arming Israel.
All right, thank you.
And why did you do it?
I did that because we are currently funding a genocide, and it needs to stop. And also, I want to make it clear to the Harris campaign that this is actually in their interest. Okay. Netanyahu is trying to instigate a larger war so he can remain in power and avoid going to prison. In order to move Netanyahu off of his current position of trying to expand the war in order to stay in power and remain out of jail, we believe that the U.S. needs to stop arming Israel. It needs to have an embargo against their genocide. Otherwise, Netanyahu doesn't have the incentive to stop the genocide, to stop the mass murder.
Why does this matter to you so much?
It matters to me so much because I'm a Jew, and I was always brought up to believe that never again means never again for anyone, anywhere, ever, period. And that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is that we are continuing to fund and support an ongoing genocide, the mass murder of children, and it needs to stop.
And as I filmed the lights being off from my perfect vantage point in the C-SPAN suite, I was stunned by the hypocrisy of the President of the United States saying this while the lights were off in an entire section of the arena to hide a life and death level disagreement within his political party.
And with a grateful heart, I stand before you now on this August night to report that democracy has prevailed. Democracy has delivered. And now democracy must be preserved.
Here was the President of the United States, while the lights were off in a whole section of the arena to hide a banner created and held by Democratic Party loyalists, displaying resistance to a plausible genocide that he himself is arming. An arena where the party is gathered to celebrate the nomination of a woman that literally no one voted for in that party's primary. And here is the president telling us that democracy has prevailed? If this is what democracy looks like to these people, lights off on any signs of dissent while celebrating the voteless anointing of their chosen insiders, if that's what democracy looks like, we are in a world of trouble. And no matter how many amazing singers or sports coaches or sports stars or Oprahs appeared on the stage, I could not shake this moment. I will never shake that moment. And as soon as the literal sign of disunity was purged from the arena, the lights were turned back on and the fake unity show continued. The next big crack in the unity facade appeared on Wednesday night, 2 nights later. And this one you may have heard about if you were online. And I don't know if this was covered on television because it happened just outside the arena. But it started on Wednesday night, on day 3. On Wednesday, to be honest with you, I had skipped the United Center speeches. I had spent the day at McCormick Center and I didn't want to deal with the 2-hour shuttle or subway commute plus nightmare security line just to watch speeches that I could see on TV. And so I watched the Wednesday night speeches in bed and learned about the sit-in while scrolling on Twitter. During the speeches on Wednesday night, a pretty large group of delegates walked out of the arena and declared that they would be sitting outside of the United Center, inside the bubble, but just outside the arena doors, until a Palestinian speaker was permitted to take the stage. And not long before the sit-in started, a family member of an Israeli hostage had spoken on the stage, and my Twitter scrolling led me to believe that the two events, an Israeli speaker and the Palestinian supporter sit-in, were connected. But this is why I've learned that it's so important to physically be at these events, because that was wrong, which I found out when I interviewed one of the delegates who had just slept on the concrete all night in front of the doors of the United Center. Here's what she told me.
My name is Asma Muhammad, and I am an uncommitted delegate from Minnesota, elected at large.
Okay, so we're talking right now outside of the United Center. To be honest with you, I skipped the speeches last night, but I was following everything on Twitter. And from my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, a group of you decided to come out here and protest after there was a family member of an Israeli hostage. Is that?
No, that's not what happened at all.
Okay, so what was the catalyst for this?
Yes, so yesterday we've been asking actually for weeks, I think actually 2 months now, for a Palestinian American to be able to speak on the main stage of the DNC. And yesterday at 8 p.m. we got word from the DNC finally, after they had been telling us for weeks and weeks that they were working on it. Yesterday at 8 p.m. on the eve of the final day of the DNC, that their answer was a no.
And did they give you a reason
No.
for why it is a no?
No. We gave them a short list of state representatives, of members of Congress, people that we thought would be incredible speakers to address the audience, the delegates, and the majority of Democrats who support a ceasefire and arms embargo. And our request was officially denied last night at 8 p.m. We had no idea that people like me, delegates, would be sleeping out here last night, but we did. And I want to make it clear that the Israeli hostage family, we were honored to hear them. And they actually called for a ceasefire. They actually called what was happening a massacre against the Palestinian people, which is more empathy than I think anyone on the main stage has shown. And I believe they had every right to speak. And I also think that this party, whose platform includes that the Israelis and Palestinians both hold equal power in our party, who are both equal in this party, that I believe that Palestinian Americans should also be able to take the stage and talk about what they have been experiencing, because I have a friend who lost 100 family members in Gaza. I have friends who have lost dozens in Gaza, and I think they deserve a right to speak.
And Representative Ro Khanna of California was interviewed after the sit-in began on the Young Turks by Anna Kasparian. And he had seen the speech that was submitted to the DNC for approval. And here's what he said about that speech.
I couldn't believe that they didn't give 5 minutes to a Palestinian American speaker. I mean, I looked at the speech, that the speech was simply saying that a lot of people in Gaza have lost their lives, and a lot of Americans who have family or know people in Gaza, and that we should honor their lives, and that we should bring the war to an end, and the hostages should be released. It was the most anodyne speech, basically asking for empathy. There was no policy direction. And this was probably of all the things in the 4 days in terms of progressives, this was the biggest miss of a layup.
You know, the people that were trying to speak on the stage, who were Palestinians who have been elected to office here in the United States, these are not people who were trying to hurt the Democratic Party, not at all. Here's Asma Muhammad again speaking to me from her concrete hotel room outside of the United Center.
I'm a lifelong Democrat. I have been organizing for Democrats up and down the ballot for pretty much my entire life, well over a decade. And when I see this, it makes me wonder how we're telling people that this party has a big tent. Because I want to win in November, and I think the best way to do that is through a ceasefire and an arms embargo. Because I know that's what people want, and I know that's how we stop killing people. I know that this party is the only party that's going to save lives. I don't think the Republican Party is going to do that. I don't think the Republican Party is going to call and say ceasefire now. I think that the Democratic Party is going to say is the only party that will go and say ceasefire now and arms embargo. I think we are the only party that can and will stand for human rights, and that's why we are here with our party.
And the support for what they're doing within the party is not insignificant.
Because what we've been doing is we've been recruiting Harris delegates to become ceasefire delegates, because those two things are not in conflict. We believe that Vice President Harris can be a candidate who supports a ceasefire and an arms embargo. And that's what we've been asking for her to do. That's been our main demand. And we now have 300 people on our list, over 300 people, delegates, at the Democratic National Convention who have signed our ceasefire letter and publicly have come out in support of a ceasefire and an arms embargo. So that should tell you a little bit about how this movement is working and how the Democratic Party leaders are not meeting the voters where we're at.
And even before having this conversation, I had been asking members of Congress why it seems like Congress is so supportive of Israel and continues to send billions of dollars in weapons to them, despite the growing resistance to their policy in the Democratic Party, the country, and the world. And Representative Glenn Ivey of Maryland gave me this answer.
It's hard for me to understand where we are such big suppliers of their weapons and their funding. Why is there not even the threat of we're going to stop sending all these bombs? Because we know what we're doing with them. Like, why is the pressure only on really the Hamas side, which we know we can't negotiate with? We have no leverage over them whatsoever, where we have so much leverage over Israel. Like, why won't that be used as a tool if we really want this to stop right now?
In part because Gaza is not the only issue. So you got Hezbollah and Iran. Hamas is just one piece of the Iranian strategy for undermining the United States and the West in general. Iran is one step away from nuclearization. Hamas is the weaker of the three with respect to Hezbollah as well. There have been attacks from Hezbollah and Lebanon on Israel, and we're at the, we're sort of hanging in the, as we speak right now, it could happen any day, but a war could jump off at that front too. And the last thing the United States needs is a stronger Iran and Hezbollah. And the Houthis, I'm not even going to talk about the Houthis, but because they're just a smaller group. So I understand why people are upset. I share the concern about the civilian deaths. And I hear people saying, we should stop sending them offensive weapons or whatever, but there are larger forces at work over there, and the United States does not want to put boots on the ground and have to deal with those issues directly. Just to be perfectly blunt about it, Israel's doing a lot of the heavy lifting from a military standpoint that I don't think the United States wants to do, especially this close on the heels of Afghanistan and some of our other issues in military conflicts in the Middle East.
So kind of the same idea of Ukraine, where if we send them the weapons, they will fight and we don't have to.
Right.
And here's Asma Muhammad's response to that.
So I talked to a member of Congress about this yesterday, and his explanation for me is for why they're sending the bombs is that...
Which member of Congress?
It was Congressman Ivey. And so he essentially explained to me that they're sending the weapons because of the threats from Hezbollah and Iran. What do you say to people who say that?
Israel has been escalating the violence by dropping bombs on children. The best way to de-escalate the violence in the Middle East is to stop dropping bombs on children and on families. We have been dropping bombs, or not we, I'm saying we because they're US-made bombs and we're paying for them. We sent $20 billion in weapons aid. We sent $20 billion in weapons aid to Israel just last week. And those are being used to target people in Iran, people in Lebanon. So that is what is escalating the tension in the Middle East. That is what is making people respond. Israel, the Israeli government, is what's causing the tension. People in Israel, hostage families, are protesting their own government because they want to stop the bombs. They don't want to kill Palestinian civilians. And the Israeli government is so set on killing and leveling the people of Gaza and their homes that they continue it.
Now, while I was speaking to Asma, I noticed that a member of Congress was standing among the sit-in crowd. Her name is Representative Delia Ramirez of Illinois, and a few hours later, she sat down with me for the most honest conversation I had about this issue with a sitting member of Congress.
So my name is Delia Ramirez, and I am the Congresswoman of Illinois' 3rd Congressional District. So Chicago, I represent the northwest side of the city and the northwestern suburbs.
One of the reasons
reasons I want to talk to you is that I first saw you outside with the uncommitted delegates. And so I'm just curious, from inside the party, do you have any insight into why they won't give any Palestinian voices even 5 minutes up on the stage?
Yeah, I don't actually, because it doesn't make sense to me. You know, we are a big tent, and we're building a huge Democratic coalition. When I say huge, the moment I say it, I think of Donald Trump, so I'm like, okay, a big Democratic coalition. I don't want the word associated with that man. And so that means that we want every single Democrat to feel like this place is theirs.
Yeah.
Chicago is one of the most inclusive cities in the world, diverse. It has the largest Palestinian diaspora in the country. And so the idea that we wouldn't have a Palestinian voice when we've had dozens and dozens of voices, important voices, diverse voices, just I think it's a dissonance to who we say we are. And I think it's also a missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity to tell Muslim Democrats, Palestinian Democrats, progressive Democrats, so many people who've been calling for a ceasefire, that I hear you, I see you. And I think that sometimes it's perhaps based on fear of what may be said there. But we have to confront the good and the bad. And this idea that we just talk about the positive things, I think it's sometimes what Americans feel disconnected from. There are some bad things. I can't pay my rent. I can't buy a house. I want to buy a new car, but I can't afford the interest rate on it. Let's acknowledge we have work to do. Let's hear each other and then commit to doing that work.
And later in our conversation, I asked again why she thinks a Palestinian speaker was being prevented from speaking by the Democratic Party.
I think that there's some fear that it feel like in a very joyful, cheerleading space where it's been electric for our VP and her future VP, that there will be some tension that will make some people feel uncomfortable. But the reality is that so many people have been sitting in discomfort, feeling like, what about me?
Yeah.
I'm a Democrat my entire life, and you're completely negating me. And I think that the fear of what may be said is outweighing for some the possibility of bringing them in. Look, if you're in this convention center, if you're on that floor, you would feel like we're about to win by 10, 15 points.
Yeah.
But the reality, when we look at polls, we're still really close. We need every one of those votes, and they want to be part of the walls of the Harris campaign, but they have to be seen and heard and feel wanted and welcome into the party. And I think at this moment, what the uncommitted delegates are saying is, we don't feel welcome. We have worked for members of Congress. We have given our life to Democrats. And this idea that, well, you know what? You should just get with it because otherwise Donald Trump will be even worse for you. I think that's very dismissive, that's disrespectful and insulting. They don't want Donald Trump to get elected.
Yeah.
But they're also really hurt that 25 of their family members have been killed and not one person there has really directly spoke to them.
And then she explained the mentality, or at least what she thinks is the mentality, of the party leaders and those in Congress who are making these choices which are alienating so many in their party and in the country.
We're in this bubble. There's a lot of fear, and there is fear of being called anti-Semitic. The idea that I would uplift the humanity of Palestinians and how that would automatically translate in me being anti-Semitic is a weapon that is used consistently to silence voices like mine. And it's not who we are. It's not who we should be.
And you'll have to listen closely for this one because she said it as she was walking away, but my microphones were still on.
I'm very happy that your voice is in Congress. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. It's very nice to meet you.
No, thank you. And thank you for those questions. Keep asking them.
I will.
And certainly AIPAC has a big role to play.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
Did you catch that? She said, quote, and certainly AIPAC has a big role to play, unquote. It's fear. Members of Congress are afraid of being called anti-Semitic, and they are afraid of AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, which is a lobbying organization that openly advocates on behalf of a foreign government, of Israel, without having to register as a foreign agent despite clearly being one. in which has spent more than $90 million already to interfere in the primaries of members of Congress who oppose arming Israel during this plausible genocide. AIPAC played a key role in the defeat of both Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush in their primaries this year. But at least one member of Congress thinks that things are changing inside Congress. This is part of my conversation with Representative Greg Kasar of Austin, Texas.
Last question. Probably not the easiest question, but I'm one of the people that's very concerned about the number of people who've been killed in the last 10 months in Gaza.
Yeah.
And
I'm more than concerned. I'm like horrified by it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the reason I wanted to ask you this question is, why do I feel such a disconnect between how so many of us feel about this and what I see in Congress, which is so much support for Israel? Like from inside, like what is that?
So what I have increasingly found is more and more members who are clear-eyed about the killing has to stop. What's horrifying and terrible is that it's even gotten to this point.
Yeah.
Because it used to be that we all said, people like Senator Lindsey Graham saying turn Gaza into a parking lot and level the place, that was like horrific and unconscionable, but tragically that has happened to such significant parts of Gaza. And so it's a horrifying situation, and it's also important to recognize that I think the movement of people speaking up has shifted the Congress, because you now have dozens and dozens and dozens of members saying we're opposed to sending more bombs and weapons there. That used to be something that didn't really happen in the Congress.
And there was one moment at the convention that I think might help push that shift further in the favor of the children of Gaza. Because on night 4, Vice President Kamala Harris accepted the party's nomination. And quick side note, if the reception for Kamala seemed kind of subdued on TV, it's because everyone in that arena was surprised when she came out on the stage. We were expecting Beyoncé to perform before her speech, and there was confusion when she walked out to a Beyoncé song without Beyoncé. The confusion was palpable, and so the applause was a bit subdued. But anyway, in Kamala's acceptance speech, she said this about Israel and Gaza.
With respect to the war in Gaza, President Biden and I are working around the clock, because now is the time to get a hostage deal and a ceasefire deal done. And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival. At the same time, what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost. Desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination.
And that roar was loud in that room. And every member of Congress, every governor, every lobbyist, and every candidate for president, every single elite in that room heard it. They felt the support that the party loyalists shouted at that line supporting the Palestinians. And I'm hoping that that roar will give the cowards in Congress the courage that they need to start putting pressure on the mass murderers in Israel's current government before they drag us all into a much bigger war. A war that we would be required to fight on behalf of those committing a plausible genocide. That roar will stay with me forever, too. And so, as I look back on both of these conventions. These events, these conventions really served as metaphors for the parties themselves. It was like the RNC presented themselves in their event as penny-pinching, socially inept, yet effective governors. And then the DNC were recklessly spending, had all the vibes, and were also incompetent. So, when it came to the RNC, they were definitely penny pinching. There was no media party. There was no open bars. I didn't eat for free once outside of the C-SPAN booth. They were also socially inept. Like the guests at the party, the journalists, we were totally ignored. And these are the people who throw tantrums if they don't get their way. Like I said, this was a weird MAGA Trump carnival, and they were fearful of people who were foreign or different. There was a lot of toxicity and a lot of weirdness. Weird is the perfect word for what the Republican Party has become. But they were also effective. Their logistics were excellent. The Republicans had all of their events in a single location, one bubble with lots of entrances and exits. I did not wait for 1 second. And the credentials were easy to understand. I had 2 badges around my neck every day, and they got me everywhere I needed to go. At one point during the DNC, because the credentials were changing every day, some of my friends had 6 credentials hanging around their necks, and they were telling us different things. So, like, I was supposed to be allowed to go onto the floor. But I was told at one point that my pass doesn't work after 2 p.m., which is bullshit. I didn't care enough to fight it, and I knew I could go somewhere else and get in. But the point is that the credentialing was a mess. And then you just kind of look bigger picture with the Republicans. They had Project Red Map back in 2010, where they decided to go through state governments. They put a lot of effort into state governments so that they could change the electoral maps to make their maps more friendly to them on the federal level. They also had the Federalist Society create a list of judges that was ready to hand to Trump when he had the opportunity to appoint 3 people to the Supreme Court. And that's the idea behind Project 2025. The Heritage Foundation basically created a list of things that they want that they were hoping to hand to Trump. But the point is that the Republicans are strategic and they think ahead. And in the policies they've gotten into law and with the judges they've gotten appointed to lifetime seats and the relative flawlessness of their event, it shows how effective they are, regardless of what you think of their priorities. And then there's the Democrats. At their event, they were recklessly spending. On Saturday night before the convention began, they threw an amazing welcome party for the media. We walked in and we were at what had to be one of the most expensive, fabulous venues, not only in Chicago, but anywhere else in the world. It was at the end of Navy Pier. It was this grand ballroom with a huge patio. They had a live band inside, a DJ outside. There were at least 7 open bars and dozens of bartenders. No one waited for 1 second for a drink. They had top shelf liquor. They had 20-something food stations. I've never seen anything like this in my life. It was like a Saudi prince's wedding. Although I don't know if the Saudis are allowed to drink booze. But regardless, they spent some cash on a welcome party for the media. They also had so many signs that they were passing out. So if you were watching on TV, the "We Love Joe," Kamala signs, Jill, Doug, "We Fight, We Win," USA, just all these signs that they were not just giving to the people on the floor, but up in the cheap seats as well, where the cameras weren't even showing them. Just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these signs. And then, of course, there was the shuttle situation, and they were having the shuttles leave when they were half full, and it was a mess. It was a mess, and they wasted so much money. I would hate to give money to the Democratic Party seeing how they used it. But then, going to their party, they gave us open bars and free food, and it was really fun. The people were likable, not only the people that I met that were delegates, but the people on the stage. Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Mr. Saxophone, Oprah was there for fuck's sake. And they treated their guests really well, almost too well, because Media Row allowed anyone to walk through there. So there were delegates, basically tourists, looking at all the famous people being interviewed. And it made my job a lot harder because it was so much more crowded than the RNC. But they were treating their guests well. And there was great music, and the speakers didn't demonize entire groups of people. I've got to tell you, I was infinitely more comfortable among the Democratic Party loyalists than I was among the Republican ones. It was just less weird. They're good when it comes to vibes. But they were also incompetent. The Democrats, like I said, had 2 venues miles apart from one another. The shuttles were a mess. The security was a mess. The badges were a mess. The volunteers had no idea what was going on. There was one night where the volunteers were directing thousands of people towards the shuttles, except we weren't being directed towards the shuttles. We were directed out of security. And so thousands of people had to find their own way home. There were old ladies crying on the street corners because they didn't have Uber and they didn't know how to download it, and I had to help them before I went to the subway. The logistics were terrible. And then you kind of expand that and look at the party as a whole. I mean, this is the party that promised universal health care and gave us an insurance-based nightmare of a healthcare system. They promised to get us out of wars, and yet we end up in multiple proxy wars with nuclear powers. There's a total lack of forward-thinking coordination in policy and event planning with the Democratic Party, as likable as these people may be. And so I've decided, after going to these events and spending time amongst both parties and their elders and their leaders, I've decided how I'm going to vote for president. And I've also decided that I'm going to tell you how I'm going to vote for president, and then I'm done talking about the presidential election on this show because we have Congress to discuss from here on forward. But in 2024, I am a voter in Texas, which is a state that has consistently voted for the Republican nominee for president since 1980, and which awards its 40 electors in a winner-take-all fashion, which means that this state that I am voting in is almost certainly going to hand its electors to Donald Trump. And I do not want Donald Trump to be president ever again. At the RNC, while I found the MAGA delegates to be fun and friendly, albeit not serious in terms of policy and governing, Donald Trump himself was the problem. As I watched him veer off his teleprompter and took 7 pages of notes about what his real thoughts were as opposed to what was scripted, it was his head where the scary stuff came from. He promised to go around Congress to do whatever he wants. He promised to drill, baby, drill, and kill renewable energy initiatives. He promised to put huge tariffs, huge taxes on imports, and we don't make anything ourselves anymore. He also branded immigrants as killers and rapists over and over and over again. And he still insists that he won the 2020 election. And I will never forgive his coordinated and successful effort to create fake election certifications for 7 states that he lost, which fraudulently said he won, and then submitted those documents as legitimate to Congress for the official counting of the electors. That's unforgivable. Donald Trump is pure chaos, and I don't want to live through another 4 years of his madness, especially since the Supreme Court has said that he would have immunity for anything he does on the job. But I also fear the kind of democracy that the Democrats are selling. Because now that the Republican Party has been fully taken over by Trump weirdness, the Democrats seem to think that the threat of Trump lets them do whatever they want. And they replaced their nominee with no votes required. And they had no acknowledgement of how bad that looks in a democracy. And they made no promises to be better in the future. And I cannot get over the silencing of Palestinian support. I was uncomfortable at the RNC because the Trump carnival was weird. But I was uncomfortable at the DNC because I could feel the presence of arrogant power that isn't listening to us. And so as a voter in a state that isn't swinging, I want to use my one vote to show that I'm uncomfortable with both of their parties. Because being at their parties, I literally was. And so on November 5th, I'm going to vote for Jill Stein of the Green Party. I'm voting for her because she most closely represents my views on war, because she's against continuing these proxy wars and being the main accomplice in a plausible genocide. And she represents my views on the environment, in that I don't think corporations should be able to poison it and us in the pursuit of profits. Now, if I were in a swing state, I would probably have to vote for Kamala Harris, because I do see Donald Trump as an unacceptable risk to the world. He has shown no strategic thinking. He basically implied at the RNC that he'd be such a psycho as commander-in-chief that the world would be too afraid to fuck with him, which is terrifying. He's promising to burn more and more fossil fuels, and again, he faked 7 election certifications in an attempt to remain president. That is ridiculous. And the people lining up to endorse him are doing so for their own careers. RFK Jr. wants to be in charge of the FDA. Trump is selling off our government in return for endorsements and cash, Because of course he is. And if I was in a swing state, I would hold my nose and vote for Kamala to keep him out of the White House. But I'm not in a swing state. I'm in Texas. And every vote that goes to a third party is a vote that helps the not Republican and not Democratic Party stay on the ballot next time. It helps that third party get funding for next time. And it helps them make their case for inclusion in the debates next time. They can look at the popular vote and say, see, we have support in this country. If we want options outside of the Republican and Democratic parties, we cannot be afraid to vote for them, especially in winner-take-all situations where I want the likely winner to lose anyway. And so I'm voting for Jill Stein. And if you don't like that, then you can vote for someone else. But this isn't up for debate. I've done my research, my mind is made up, and I'm done focusing on the presidency. Our power is in Congress. And so for the next 10 weeks or so, I'm going to be focusing on Congress. And I think you should too. Congress and your local government, because Congress is where our power is in the federal government, but your local government has the most direct effect on your life. And it's a tragedy that the presidential election sucks up all the oxygen in the media rooms. But before I end this episode, I do want to tell you a few more stories from the DNC, stories about my experience there, but I don't want to share these stories with freeloaders who emailed me in bad faith after I shared my experience at the RNC. And so if you're not paying me for my work, this is where I leave you. And I will continue this episode in my green room, which you can access right away by supporting the show on Patreon. And by the way, since the last episode, I did research the changes that Patreon is going to make, and the solution to it is quite clear for us. And these changes are, thank God, not going to be an existential threat to this podcast. But basically, Patreon is going to be ending the per-episode payment model that we have been using here on Congressional Dish for years. And that's annoying because right now, I have no other way to charge you per episode if that's how you like to pay. But because we have so consistently produced Congressional Dish at a rate of 2 episodes per month, the solution for us is pretty easy. When the time comes, producers who pay on Patreon will have your payments switched to monthly, and you will be charged the same amount you would pay for 2 episodes per month. Unless you had set a cap on your payments, in which case you won't be charged anything higher than your cap. Now, I have until November until I pay any financial price for not doing that, and so we won't be changing a damn thing on Patreon until November at the earliest. But I'll keep you posted on the timing of this as we go forward. But what that means for today is that if you want to hear about my crazy subway ride with a drug dealer, or if you want to hear about me getting ghosted by a congressman, or if you want to hear about how I stole a booth to get interviews with members of Congress, or if you want to hear about how I got bumped by Sky News because of an elevator, or if you want to hear about how I almost started drinking again, all of that and more will be in the green room for you on Patreon. And so pledge whatever you think is fair per episode, and you'll be in my private club. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank our executive producers, both of whom put their credits on the last episode, the spooky as hell episode number 298, Drafting World War III. First, I'd like to thank Amy Holland, who's been producing this show for so long that she's come to feel like a friend to me. So thank you, Amy. And I'd like to thank Ben Barnett, who left a note along with his EP credit, which says, quote, I just listened to the most recent episode, Congressional Dish 298. I learned a lot of scary information about how the psychopaths marching us towards World War III are running our country. Definitely not information I've heard anywhere else. I think I have enough donations up to this point to claim another executive producer credit, so I'd like to claim a credit for this episode. It's just another example of how Jen produces important content that I don't think I would hear about anywhere else. Thank you for all you do, Ben Burnett, unquote. And it's truly my pleasure. Thank you for supporting the show. And speaking of my pleasure, before I sign off on this main episode, I do want to say one personal thing to everyone. Because as I was walking out of the DNC on the last night, I paused outside the United Center and was overwhelmed with emotions because I was allowed to be there. Because just moments before, Kamala Harris had accepted the nomination. And regardless of everything I've said about the party and how she became the nominee, because Trump is such a unique brand of awful, I do think that there is a good chance that I was in the room when the first woman president accepted the nomination from her party. And in an election year with very little to celebrate, regardless of who wins, that would be something to celebrate. And it felt like such a privilege to be in that room. And I never would have been in that room without this podcast. And this podcast never would have lasted this long and been approved as legitimate news by the House of Representatives if it weren't for you. Your support for this show has changed my life. My dream was to have a job that I could do from anywhere in the world so that I could travel and understand the world. And I wanted to be performing work that I could do guilt-free. Because all of my other jobs, there was some guilt attached. Like, I had to evict good people from their homes as a corporate landlord. And I was serving people poison as a waitress in a string of bars. I mean, for Christ's sake, I sent tourists up to timeshare presentations, and God only knows what bad financial decisions were made up there. But my conscience is clean with this show and this job. And I get to tell you things that need to be told. Episodes like Congressional Dish 298, Drafting World War III, the consequences of those discussions are enormous, and being able to shine light on those conversations, it's a privilege. And now being able to attend some of these meetings of elites that are closed off to everyone who's not a DC insider, to get to be a fly on those walls. I was so uncomfortable, but it was a privilege. And the insights that I still haven't fully processed from getting to be at these events this summer, but these insights are going to help me do my job so much better going forward. And it's all because of you. It might feel like, $5 or $10 or $20 a month to you. For some of you, a rounding error in your finances. But the cumulative of every producer's contributions together, we've built something real here. And standing outside the United Center, inside a bubble that so few people were granted entry, all I could feel was overwhelming gratitude for you. So thank you. Because this feels like a new era of this show. And the episode number is adding to that as well. Because the next episode is going to be episode 300 of Congressional Dish. And it's going to be released right around, if not on, the 12-year anniversary of the first episode of this show. And this milestone, hitting it right now after these conventions, I feel like there's a shift happening. I can't really explain what that means, but it's like a leveling up. And so this milestone feels bigger than most. 300 episodes, 12 years, and official legitimacy. I'm very proud of this podcast and this community. And so thank you for being a part of it. Thank you for listening and supporting. And if you haven't started supporting yet, that's okay, because we are just getting started. And so if you want to be a part of this going forward, pick whatever method works best for you on the Support the Show page on congressionaldish.com. But Patreon is the easiest way to get access to the green room right now. But just know, I am so appreciative of you. Whether you have shared the show or helped produce it with money or your time, I know I didn't do this alone. So thanks for being a part of this. And whether we've met in person or we're friends from afar, please know that I truly love you. And I'm excited to keep building this together. Okay. That's it for the main show. Now let's go gossip in the green room. Until episode 300, I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies.
bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.